The date is February 16th, 1945. Berlin is burning. Tokyo is crumbling under firebombs. The history books will tell you that World War III ended because armies were defeated, because cities fell, because generals surrendered. But that's the story we tell children. The truth is simpler and far more brutal. They didn't lose because of tanks or planes. They lost because the money ran out. Wars are not won on battlefields. They are won in ledgers. And when the final entry is made, when the balance sheet tips into the red and never recovers, empires don't fall dramatically. They simply stop functioning. This is the story of what happens when the world's accountants close the books for good. Before the missiles fell, before the alliances shattered, the global economy was an illusion of permanence. Markets hummed 24 hours a day. Cargo ships the size of cities crossed oceans carrying goods nobody truly needed. Money moved at the speed of light through fiber optic cables, millions changing hands in microseconds. The world looked powerful, connected, unstoppable. Skyscrapers reached into clouds. Highways stretched across continents. Every phone contained more computing power than the machines that sent men to the moon. We believed we had built something immortal. We were wrong. Beneath the chrome and glass, beneath the stock tickers and the trade agreements, the foundation was rotting. The global economy wasn't built on strength. It was built on debt, speculation, and the assumption that tomorrow would always look like today. The addiction started decades before the war. Nations borrowed against futures they could never deliver. Central banks printed currency backed by nothing but faith. The United States owed $35 trillion. China held $14 trillion in dollar-denominated assets that would become worthless overnight. European banks were leveraged 40-1, meaning for every dollar they actually possessed, they had promised 40. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio had climbed past 260%. These weren't economies. They were Ponzi schemes wearing the costume of civilization. And the monster feeding on it all was something invisible but unstoppable: compound interest. Every nation owed someone. Every creditor was also a debtor. The whole system depended on one fundamental lie, that growth would continue forever. When the first missile launched, that lie died instantly. The initial strikes targeted military installations, nuclear silos, command centers. But the real damage happened in places without explosions. On March 3rd, global stock markets opened and immediately crashed. Circuit breakers triggered within 90 seconds. Trading halted. It never resumed. Banks locked their doors not because of bombs, but because the interbank lending system had frozen solid. When trust evaporates, credit dies. And credit is the oxygen of modern economies. By March 7th, the SWIFT system had collapsed. International wire transfers became impossible. A clothing manufacturer in Bangladesh couldn't receive payment from a retailer in Chicago. An oil tanker in the Persian Gulf sat motionless because the shipping company's insurance had been invalidated. The global supply chain didn't break. It evaporated. Within 2 weeks, gas stations across the United States ran dry, not because refineries were destroyed, but because the futures market for crude oil had ceased to exist. Let me give you numbers that make this real. Before the war, the global economy moved $100 trillion annually. 90% of that movement was digital, entries and databases maintained by institutions that required electricity, internet, and most critically, trust. When those three things disappeared, so did $90 trillion of economic activity. It didn't burn. It didn't explode. It simply stopped being real. The remaining 10 trillion, the physical goods, the actual food and fuel and medicine, became the only economy that mattered. And $10 trillion divided among 8 billion people equals $1,250 per person per year. That's subsistence. That's pre-industrial. That's what happens when the ledger closes. The smoking gun moment came on April 19th at a bunker beneath the Swiss Alps. What remained of the G7 finance ministers met in secret. No press, no transcript. But 3 people who were in that room later described the same scene. The U.S. Treasury Secretary laid out a single sheet of paper. It contained one paragraph. Effective immediately, all dollar-denominated debt instruments are suspended indefinitely. The Federal Reserve will not honor redemptions. The full faith and credit of the United States government is hereby acknowledged as insufficient. Think about what that means. It means the world's reserve currency had just declared bankruptcy. 70% of global trade had been conducted in dollars. Central banks held dollars as their primary reserve asset. Trillions in treasury bonds, once considered the safest investment on earth, became decorative paper. It was the largest default in human history, and it happened with a memo. Russia followed within hours, announcing it would no longer service its external debt. China's statement was more carefully worded, but it meant the same thing. The money you lent us no longer exists. The European Central Bank tried to maintain the fiction for 6 more days before admitting the euro had no backing. The yen, the pound, the yuan, every major currency collapsed, not gradually but instantly. Because modern currency isn't backed by gold or silver or anything tangible. It's backed by belief. And belief can die in an afternoon. This wasn't inflation. This wasn't a recession. This was the complete failure of the global monetary system. Money didn't lose value. It lost meaning. By May, the social consequences became visible in ways that made the missile strikes look merciful. In Tokyo, a city of 14 million people, the water stopped flowing on May 11th. Not because the pipes were broken, but because the utility company had no way to pay employees or buy chemicals for treatment. Workers simply stopped showing up. In Berlin, hospitals ran out of anesthesia, not because supplies were destroyed, but because the pharmaceutical supply chain required 16 different countries cooperating. When those countries stopped talking, complex medicines stopped existing. In New York City, grocery stores emptied in 72 hours. The trucks stopped coming because fuel required payment systems that no longer functioned. The food was still being grown. The trucks still existed. But the invisible threads of commerce that connected farmer to shelf had been severed completely. Here's what starvation looks like in a modern city. First, people eat what's in their pantries. That lasts a week. Then they eat what they can barter for. That lasts another week if they're lucky. Then they start looking at pets, at pigeons, at rats. Then they start looking at each other. The United Nations estimated that 1.3 billion people faced severe food insecurity within 90 days of the war's beginning. Not from bombs, from logistics failure. Sovereignty is solvency, and every nation on earth had just been foreclosed upon. The countries that survived did so not because of military strength, but because of geographic luck. New Zealand became a lifeboat by accident of distance. Its population of 5 million had access to farmland, fresh water, and isolation. Brazil's interior, far from the coastal cities, reverted to agricultural self-sufficiency within months. Remote regions of Canada, already accustomed to harsh conditions and independence, formed cooperative networks faster than centralized governments could collapse. But these were exceptions. Most of humanity lived in places that required constant external support, and that support had been cut permanently. Let me walk you through what happened to the United States, the world's largest economy. The federal government ceased meaningful function by June, not because Washington was destroyed, but because tax revenue had dropped 94%. You can't collect income tax when nobody has income. You can't collect corporate tax when corporations have dissolved. The Treasury printed currency for 3 more weeks before acknowledging it was printing colored paper. State governments took over, but they faced the same problem. How do you govern without money? Some states fragmented further. California split into 4 distinct regions, each centered around water access. Texas closed its borders and operated as an independent entity. The Midwest became a loose confederation of agricultural communities. The map of America didn't change officially. It changed practically. Russia experienced something similar but faster. Moscow's control over Siberia and the Far East depended on fuel, communication, and force. When fuel became impossible to distribute and communication networks failed, regions simply stopped responding to orders. By August, 17 different entities claimed governmental authority over former Russian territory. None of them controlled more than a few hundred miles from their capital. A nation the size of a continent cannot function without the infrastructure of connection, and that infrastructure requires money that no longer existed. China's collapse was the most dramatic because its economy had been the most fragile. The entire system depended on factories producing goods for export, which required ships, which required fuel, which required payment systems. When global trade stopped, 600 million factory workers had no work. The government tried to maintain order through rationing, but rationing requires a distribution system. By September, the coastal megacities began to empty. People walked inland, returning to rural provinces where at least food could be grown. The government's authority contracted to a radius of 50 miles around Beijing. Beyond that, local party officials either became warlords or were replaced by whoever controlled food supplies. Europe's tragedy was different. It was a slow-motion starvation. The European Union had built an economy that required constant energy imports, primarily natural gas from Russia and oil from the Middle East. When those supply lines cut, the continent had 90 days of stored energy. Then the lights went out. Not everywhere at once, but rolling, spreading like a shadow crossing the map. Industrial production stopped first, then heating, then water treatment, then food preservation. By winter, mortality rates in northern Europe reached levels not seen since the Black Death. Not from violence, from cold and hunger. The new map that emerged wasn't drawn by politicians or generals. It was drawn by river systems, aquifers, and growing seasons. Nations reformed around natural resources. The Great Lakes region became a single political entity, regardless of old U.C. Canada borders. The Nile River Valley became a unified state from Uganda to Egypt, because water mattered more than nationality. The Amazon basin, once divided among 9 countries, became controlled by regional coalitions who understood that rainforest and river were inseparable. Borders returned to what they had always been before modern transportation made them arbitrary. They became the lines where one watershed ended and another began. Governments that survived were the ones that understood a brutal truth immediately. Legitimacy comes from function, not authority. A government that could deliver clean water was legitimate. A government that could organize harvest distribution was legitimate. A government that promised future prosperity while people starved was nothing. Power devolved to the smallest unit that could be effective. In some places that was a town. In others a neighborhood. The mayor who could keep the sewage system working had more real power than any president. The community organizer who could mediate disputes over food distribution was more valuable than any general. Authority became radically local and radically practical. The economy that emerged from the ruins was older than money itself. Barter, yes, but more sophisticated than simple exchange. Networks of trust replaced currency. A farmer who consistently delivered grain became wealthy in reputation. A mechanic who could repair solar panels became essential. A doctor with medicine became a community cornerstone. Value returned to utility. A mansion meant nothing if you couldn't heat it. A sports car was worth less than a bicycle because fuel didn't exist. Wealth became measurable in seeds, tools, antibiotics, and knowledge. The rich, in the old sense, died quickly if they couldn't adapt. The prepared, the skilled, the cooperative, they survived. Daily life changed in ways both terrible and strangely human. Without electricity, evenings ended at sunset. Communities gathered around fires, not screens. Stories returned as entertainment. Music was live or it didn't exist. Children learned by apprenticeship because schools required resources that weren't available. Education became intensely practical. How to plant, how to preserve, how to build, how to heal. The separation between intellectual and physical labor dissolved. Philosophers became farmers. Engineers became carpenters. The modern world's greatest luxury, specialization, became impossible. But here's what the disaster films never show. People adapted. Humans are stunningly resilient when necessity demands it. Within 6 months, new routines established themselves. Communities organized watch rotations, food distribution schedules, water collection systems. Trade routes reopened, small at first, caravans moving between towns, then regions. Sailboats appeared on rivers and coastlines because they required no fuel. Bicycles became more valuable than cars. Solar panels, once decorative symbols of environmental consciousness, became survival equipment. Technology didn't disappear. It simplified to what could be maintained locally. By the second year, a strange new stability emerged. Not prosperity, not comfort, but predictability. People knew what to expect. Starvation rates declined not because food became abundant, but because populations and resources reached equilibrium. The die-off, the terrible first 18 months when the elderly, the sick, and the unprepared perished, had ended. Those who remained were survivors by definition. And they began building something new, not a return to the old world, a different world entirely. The future that emerged looked nothing like the past. Nations existed, but they were smaller, more homogeneous, more self-reliant. The age of global empire ended not with a treaty, but with the simple impossibility of projection. You cannot control territory you cannot supply. International trade returned, but slowly, cautiously, in physical goods only. A new merchant class emerged, people who could move goods between regions safely. They became wealthy, but their wealth was in relationships and routes, not in abstract financial instruments. Money eventually returned, but backed by grain and oil and silver, things you could touch and measure. Fiat currency became a historical curiosity, a remembered mistake. Culture changed in fundamental ways. The survivor generation, those who lived through the collapse, never forgot. They became obsessively practical. Waste became the greatest sin. Self-sufficiency became the highest virtue. Their children grew up in a world where the old era existed only in stories and ruins. They explored abandoned cities like archaeologists, pulling useful materials from skeletons of skyscrapers. They didn't miss the old world because they never knew it. Their education focused on survival skills and community maintenance. They learned 7 languages, not from apps, but from traders who visited. They learned engineering from rebuilding what had broken. They learned governance from participating in it daily. History became intensely important in ways it hadn't been before the war. Every community preserved its story, not in data centers, but in written records, in oral tradition, in physical monuments. The question, how did we get here, was answered with specificity and sorrow. Children learned the exact sequence of failures that led to collapse. They learned it so the mistakes wouldn't be repeated. The fall became a founding myth, a cautionary tale carved into collective memory. And slowly, over decades, technology returned. Not all at once, not in a rush, but deliberately. Small hydroelectric plants powered villages. Wind turbines appeared where wind was consistent. Radio communication resumed, first locally, then regionally. By the 3rd decade after the war, telegraph lines connected major population centers. It resembled the late 1800s technologically, but with the knowledge of what had been lost. This created a different trajectory. Technology was adopted only when it could be sustained locally. The temptation to build systems too complex to maintain had been burned out of human consciousness. Trade networks expanded carefully. Coastal communities built sailboats with auxiliary engines for calm days. Rail lines were rebuilt where they connected resource-rich areas. A new merchant marine emerged, slower than container ships, but more reliable. Currency unions formed around shared watersheds or mountain ranges. The Amazon credit was backed by stored grain. The Great Lakes dollar was backed by industrial capacity. The Mediterranean dinar was backed by olive oil and solar panel production. Money became regional and tangible again. Inflation was controlled not by central banks, but by the physical limit of backing assets. Eventually, something like international order returned, not through military alliance, but through mutual dependence. The Grain Council met annually to coordinate harvests and prevent famine. The Water Compact regulated shared river systems. The Medical Alliance distributed vaccine production. These organizations had power not through force but through necessity. No nation could afford to be excluded. Cooperation became compulsory because isolation meant death. The New World Order was built on the recognition of interdependence, learned through catastrophic loss. 73 years after the last missiles fell, the final debt from the pre-war era was officially forgiven. A symbolic gesture, really, since the money to pay it had never existed. But the ceremony mattered. Representatives from 47 nations gathered in Geneva, now a small city of 12,000, and signed the final settlement. It acknowledged that the debt of the old world could not and would not be paid. That generation of obligation had died. The slate was wiped clean. Not through payment, but through recognition that the currency of that debt no longer meant anything. It was a funeral for the old financial system, 73 years late. The world that exists now, generations after the collapse, is smaller in some ways, larger in others. Smaller in speed and complexity, in the reach of individual power. Larger in community, in stability, in the meaningfulness of daily life. People know their neighbors not from social media, but from shared labor. They understand where their food comes from because they often grow it. They maintain their own infrastructure because no distant corporation will do it for them. Convenience is gone. Resilience has taken its place.